Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, keeping you company for a quiet moment of thought. Tell me, how does your evening find you? Is the lamp lit, the rain tapping softly at the window, a cup of tea cooling at your side? These were the hours Dr. Watson trusted most, when patience sharpened the mind and small details spoke freely. If you enjoy such calm inquiries, do consider subscribing to Watson's Margins. Now, settle in, for it is observation, not haste, that brings us closest to the truth. Chapter 1. The Quiet House in Montague Square. It was in the spring of the year 1895 that my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes received a most curious invitation, one which, though couched in terms of perfect civility, carried with it an undercurrent of unease that even the casual reader might have detected. The note arrived at our Baker Street lodgings on a Tuesday morning, borne by a liveried servant who waited with that species of patient immobility peculiar to those who serve in great houses. Holmes read it once, handed it to me without comment, and resumed his study of the morning papers with an air of studied indifference that I had long since learned to recognise as genuine interest. The letter was from a Sir Arthur Pembroke, a name unfamiliar to me but which Holmes appeared to know. Sir Arthur expressed his desire that Holmes might honour him with a visit at his residence in Montague Square that very afternoon, at 4 o'clock, to discuss a matter which, whilst not urgent in the criminal sense, was nevertheless of considerable delicacy. Several other guests would be present, he wrote, persons connected to his professional life, and he should be most grateful for Holmes's insight regarding a question of historical propriety. "You know the man?" I inquired, returning the letter. "By reputation only," Holmes replied, not lifting his eyes from the newspaper. Sir Arthur Pembroke retired from the Colonial Office some 7 years ago, having spent the better part of 3 decades in positions of considerable trust. His record is without blemish, his discretion legendary. It is said that more state secrets passed through his hands than through those of any man save the Prime Minister himself, and yet not one word of scandal ever attached to his name. An admirable servant of the Crown, then? Admirably silent, certainly. Holmes folded the paper with a snap. Which makes this invitation all the more intriguing. Men who have spent their lives keeping secrets do not lightly invite scrutiny, even under the guise of a social gathering. We shall attend, Watson, and you would do well to bring your notebook. I suspect we are about to enter a house where every word has been carefully weighed before utterance. At the appointed hour, we presented ourselves at number 14 Montague Square, a substantial but unpretentious townhouse of the sort favoured by successful civil servants who wish to suggest prosperity without ostentation. The door was opened by an elderly manservant whose demeanour combined deference with a certain protective wariness, as though he stood guard not merely at a threshold, but at the boundary of some more profound privacy. We were shown into a drawing-room that struck me immediately as possessing an almost oppressive orderliness. Every book upon the shelves stood in perfect alignment, every ornament occupied its place with geometrical precision, and the very air seemed to have been arranged to avoid any suggestion of movement or spontaneity. It was a room, I thought, where nothing was permitted to be out of place, where accident and chance had been systematically excluded. Holmes's eyes moved over these details with that peculiar intensity of observation which I had witnessed 1,000 times, yet which never ceased to fascinate me. He noted, I was certain, far more than I could perceive, and when his gaze came to rest upon the marble fireplace perfectly, clean and innocent of any ash or residue, a faint smile touched his lips. Sir Arthur Pembroke himself soon appeared, a tall, spare man of perhaps 70 years, with iron-grey hair and eyes of remarkable clarity. His bearing was erect, his manner courteous, yet there was about him something of the fortress, as though his entire life had been spent in fortification against disorder and revelation. He greeted Holmes with evident respect, and me with the polite acknowledgment due to a gentleman's companion. "It is most kind of you to come, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying that measured quality common to those who have learned never to speak carelessly. I have assembled here today several persons connected to my former professional life, and I find myself in want of counsel regarding certain historical matters. Perhaps you will permit me to introduce you to my guests before I explain further. The company consisted of 4 individuals, each of whom Sir Alister presented with a formality that seemed calculated to reveal nothing beyond bare identification. First was Mr. Edmund Carstairs, who had served as Sir Alister's private secretary during the latter years of his tenure at the Colonial Office. Carstairs was a man of perhaps 50, neatly dressed but with an air of diminished circumstances about him, a certain threadbare quality to his otherwise respectable appearance that suggested genteel poverty. Next came Miss Lavinia Pembroke, introduced as Sir Alister's cousin, a handsome woman of middle years whose composed features nonetheless betrayed a certain watchfulness, as though she were perpetually alert to some anticipated difficulty. Her dress was elegant but severe, her manner cordial yet guarded. The third guest was Mr. Septimus Rathbone, a solicitor whose firm had handled Sir Alister's legal affairs for 2 decades. Rathbone possessed the careful neutrality of expression cultivated by his profession, yet I detected in his eyes a flicker of concern that no professional discipline could entirely conceal. Finally, there was Dr. Theodore Blackwood, Sir Alister's personal physician, a stout gentleman with a florid complexion and the hearty manner of one who wishes to project confidence in all circumstances. Yet even he, I noticed, spoke with a certain hesitation, as though uncertain how much or how little ought to be said. The conversation that followed was among the most peculiar I have ever witnessed. It possessed all the outward forms of polite society, yet beneath the surface ran currents of tension and unspoken meaning that rendered every innocuous remark somehow weighted with significance. Sir Alister spoke of his years in government service, touching upon various administrative matters with the vagueness of one who has been trained never to be specific. The others contributed their recollections, but always with a curious restraint, as though some invisible boundary existed beyond which none dared venture. Holmes listened with an attention that might have appeared casual to those who did not know him, occasionally asking a question of such apparent irrelevance that I wondered at his purpose. Yet I observed that each query produced a momentary discomfort in one or another of the guests, a fleeting expression swiftly concealed but never quite successfully. It was when the conversation turned to the question of Sir Alister's archived papers that the atmosphere grew most strained. Our host spoke with evident pride of his meticulous habits, explaining that throughout his career he had maintained the strictest protocols regarding confidential documents. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes," he said, with an emphasis that struck me as excessive, "that no document of any importance remains in my possession. Everything requiring disposal has been disposed of according to the proper procedures. I have retained nothing that might compromise the interests of the Crown." "How very thorough," Holmes remarked, his tone perfectly neutral. "And yet I observe that your fireplaces, though admirably clean, bear no evidence of having been used for such purposes. The marble shows no heat discoloration, no ash residue has penetrated the crevices of the hearth. One might almost think nothing had ever been burned here." The silence that followed this observation was profound. Sir Alister's expression did not change, yet something in his posture suggested a man who has been suddenly confronted with an uncomfortable truth. "I employed other means," he said at last. "Professional destruction through approved channels." "Of course," Holmes said pleasantly, though his eyes remained sharp. "And that locked cabinet in your study, the one with the brass handle worn smooth by frequent use, does that too contain only documents of no importance?" How Holmes had observed this cabinet, when we had not yet been admitted to the study, I could not imagine. Yet the effect of his words was electric. Carstairs shifted in his chair, Miss Pembroke's hand moved involuntarily to her throat, and even the imperturbable Rathbone betrayed a start of surprise. Only Dr. Blackwood maintained his composure, though his face had grown notably redder. Sir Alister recovered himself with admirable swiftness. "You're as observant as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes. Yes, there remains one file, though its contents are of purely historical interest. Perhaps, if you would care to step into my study, I might explain the nature of my concerns more fully." As we rose to follow our host, I caught Holmes's eye and saw there a gleam of satisfaction. Whatever we had been summoned to witness, it was now clear that the performance had begun in earnest, and that each player in this careful drama was bound by ties of shared history that none wished to acknowledge, yet none could entirely escape. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. Chapter 2. A Man Who Burned Nothing. The study into which Sir Alister led us was a chamber that seemed to embody the very essence of its owner's character. 3 walls were lined with mahogany shelving, upon which stood row upon row of ledgers, their spines labelled with dates and reference numbers in a hand of meticulous precision. A large desk dominated the centre of the room, its surface bearing only a blotter, an inkstand, and a single lamp, all arranged with that same geometric exactitude I had observed in the drawing-room. Against the 4th wall stood the cabinet to which Holmes had so pointedly referred, a substantial piece of furniture fitted with a lock of obvious quality, and a brass handle that indeed showed the polish of frequent handling. Sir Alister gestured us to chairs and seated himself behind the desk with the air of a man accustomed to conducting interviews rather than submitting to them. For a moment he sat in silence, his fingers steepled before him, as though weighing his words with the care of one who has spent a lifetime understanding their consequences. "Mr. Holmes," he began at length, "I have asked you here because I find myself in a position of some delicacy. Throughout my career, I prided myself upon absolute discretion. Documents that passed through my hands were treated with the reverence due to matters of state. When they were no longer required, they were destroyed through proper channels or returned to their originating departments. I kept nothing that might prove embarrassing to the government or compromising to individuals. And yet," Holmes observed mildly, "you speak in the past tense, as though this admirable practice has encountered some exception." A flicker of discomfort crossed Sir Alister's features. "There remains one file," he admitted, "a single collection of documents relating to an inquiry conducted some 20 years ago. At the time, I was charged with administrative oversight of a commission examining certain irregularities within the colonial administration of British Honduras. The matter was resolved quietly, the commission dissolved, and the findings never formally published." "For reasons of diplomatic expediency, no doubt," Holmes suggested. "Precisely. And yet the file itself was never destroyed. I was instructed to retain it under seal, with the understanding that it might prove necessary should related questions arise. They never did. The file has remained locked away, untouched, for 2 decades. Holmes rose and moved to the cabinet, examining it with that intense scrutiny he brought to all physical evidence. "This lock has been opened recently," he remarked. "The mechanism shows signs of regular use, despite your assertion that the contents have remained untouched. The wear pattern on the handle suggests weekly, perhaps even daily manipulation." Sir Alister's composure wavered. "I may have checked the security of the lock from time to time. A man grows cautious in his later years, or perhaps increasingly troubled by the burden of what he guards." Holmes returned to his seat. "The persons assembled in your drawing-room, they were all connected to this commission, were they not?" "In various capacities." Sir Alister's voice had grown quieter. "Carstairs served as junior clerk to the inquiry. My cousin Lavinia was companion to the wife of one of the commissioners. Rathbone provided legal guidance on procedural matters. Dr. Blackwood attended to the medical needs of several witnesses who gave testimony. A diverse assembly, yet united by this singular event." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Sir Alister, what prompted you to gather them here today? And why summon a consulting detective to witness what appears to be a reunion of old colleagues?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. Through the closed door came the muted sounds of conversation from the drawing-room, voices carefully modulated, as though their owners feared being overheard. "I'm 73 years old, Mr. Holmes," Sir Alister said finally. "A man at such an age begins to contemplate his legacy, the record he will leave behind. I have lived an honourable life, or so I believed, and yet this file troubles me increasingly. There are truths within it that were suppressed for what seemed good reasons at the time. Now I am not certain those reasons remain valid, if indeed they ever were. You are considering making the contents public. I am considering the moral question of whether I have the right to take such knowledge to my grave. But the matter is complicated by the fact that I am not the only person whose interests are affected. The testimony contained in that file, if revealed, would prove deeply embarrassing to individuals still living. Some were victims of injustice, others perpetrators of it. The line between the two is not always clear." Holmes's expression had grown thoughtful. "And your guests? How do they regard this potential revelation?" "I have not been explicit with them," Sir Alister replied. "But they are intelligent people. They know why I have gathered them. Each has reason to fear what the file contains, or to hope for its continued suppression, depending upon their particular circumstances. Yet you speak of it only in the most oblique terms, even now." Holmes stood and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "You invited me here to observe this gathering, presumably to gain some insight into whether you should proceed with disclosure, but you have not shown me the file itself, nor have you been candid about its specific contents. How am I to advise you when you provide me with shadows rather than facts?" "Because the facts themselves are dangerous, Mr. Holmes. Knowledge of them confers a burden that I am reluctant to share. Once spoken, certain truths cannot be unspoken. Once known, they cannot be unknown." "Then you place me in an impossible position. You ask for guidance whilst withholding the very information necessary to provide it." Sir Alister rose and moved to the cabinet. For a moment I thought he would open it, but instead his hand merely rested upon the lock, as though drawing some obscure comfort from its solidity. "The file concerns a matter of betrayal," he said quietly. "During the Commission's proceedings, testimony was given that implicated certain individuals in actions that, had they been made public, would have destroyed careers and reputations. Some of that testimony was demonstrably false, motivated by personal grievance. Some of it was undeniably true. The Commission's final report deliberately obscured these distinctions, choosing instead a vague formula that satisfied political necessity while sacrificing precise justice. And the consequences of this compromise? One man was quietly ruined. His career ended on pretext unrelated to the Commission's actual findings. Another was protected, allowed to continue in his position despite clear evidence of malfeasance. The true victims were never vindicated, the true guilty never punished. The file contains the raw testimony, the unvarnished truth that the official record concealed." Holmes had ceased his pacing, and now stood perfectly still, his keen eyes fixed upon our host. "And which of your guests falls into which category? Who was ruined? Who protected? Who wronged?" "That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely what I cannot tell you without violating the very discretion I have maintained for 20 years. But I will say this. Every person in my drawing room today lives in the shadow of that commission. Some know they are guilty and fear exposure. Some believe they are innocent and fear being wrongly implicated. Some carry wounds that have never healed, and at least one among them would do almost anything to ensure that file remains sealed forever. You speak as though you anticipate violence. I speak as a man who has observed how desperately people cling to comfortable lies, Mr. Holmes. The truth, when it has been buried for 20 years, acquires a kind of monstrous power. It becomes not merely fact, but judgment, not merely history, but verdict. To resurrect it now would be to pass sentence on the living for crimes committed when they were young. Yet you are considering doing precisely that. Sir Alister returned to his desk and sank into his chair with evident weariness. I am considering whether I have the moral right to do otherwise. A man's final act defines him, Mr. Holmes. I do not wish to be remembered as one who valued peace over justice, convenience over truth." "A noble sentiment," Holmes replied, "though nobility and wisdom do not always coincide. But tell me this. Have any of your guests attempted to influence your decision? Has anyone directly asked you to destroy the file, or conversely to reveal it?" "No one has been so direct, but I have received letters, oblique and unsigned, suggesting that some matters are best left in the past. I have also detected in recent weeks a certain surveillance of this house. Nothing overt, you understand, merely the sense that my movements are being observed with more than casual interest." "Then you believe yourself to be in danger?" "I believe myself to be the custodian of a secret that has become intolerable to those who share it. Whether that manifests as danger or merely discomfort, I cannot say." Holmes moved to the window and gazed out upon Montague Square, where the afternoon light was beginning to fade into evening. "You have created an extraordinary situation, Sir Alister. You have assembled the very persons who have most to fear from revelation, informed them implicitly of your intentions, and then invited an investigator to observe the result. It is almost as though you are conducting an experiment, testing to see which among them will break first." "Perhaps that is precisely what I am doing," Sir Alister admitted. "Perhaps I hoped that by forcing this confrontation some resolution would emerge that I have been unable to discover through solitary contemplation. Or perhaps," Holmes said softly, turning from the window, "you are playing a far more dangerous game than you realise. Tell me, Sir Alister, how long do you intend to keep your guests assembled here?" "I have invited them to dine. They will depart after the meal." "Then you have perhaps 3 hours in which to make your decision. I suggest you spend them wisely, for I suspect that once your guests disperse, the situation will resolve itself in ways you may not anticipate or welcome." With that cryptic pronouncement, Holmes indicated that our interview was concluded. As we returned to the drawing-room, where the assembled company maintained their careful discourse, I found myself deeply troubled. It seemed to me that we had entered not a house but a trap, one whose mechanism was wound tight with 20 years of accumulated tension, and that the slightest disturbance might cause it to spring with terrible consequences. Holmes, however, appeared almost satisfied, as though the problem before him had finally achieved a clarity he found aesthetically pleasing. He resumed his observation of the company with renewed attention, and I knew that behind that mask of polite interest, his remarkable mind was already at work upon the puzzle Sir Alister had set before him. The game, I reflected grimly, was indeed afoot, but I could not shake the sensation that we were not the hunters, but merely witnesses to a hunt already in progress. Chapter 3. The night the cabinet was opened. I was awakened the following morning by an urgent knocking upon our door at Baker Street. The grey light of dawn had barely begun to illuminate the street below, and I heard Mrs. Hudson's voice raised in protest at the unseasonable hour. Holmes, already dressed and standing by the window with that alert stillness which suggested he had not slept, moved swiftly to admit our visitor before our landlady could turn him away. It was the manservant from Montague Square, the same elderly fellow who had admitted us the previous day, but now his composure had entirely deserted him. His face was ashen, his hands trembled, and he could scarcely form the words to convey his message. "Mr. Holmes, sir, you must come at once. Sir Alister, he's dead, sir. Found him not an hour ago, sitting at his desk, as peaceful as you please, but stone cold, sir, stone cold." Within 20 minutes we had arrived at number 14, where we found the household in that peculiar state of subdued chaos that attends unexpected death. Dr. Blackwood was already present, having been summoned immediately upon the discovery. He met us in the hallway, his florid countenance now grave with professional solemnity. "A sad business, gentlemen," he said, lowering his voice. "Sir Alister appears to have passed quietly in the night, most likely a failure of the heart. At his age, and given the strain he had been under, it is hardly surprising, though of course deeply regrettable." "You have examined the body?" Holmes inquired. "Only cursorily, pending the arrival of the authorities." But I have been Sir Alister's physician for 15 years, Mr. Holmes. I know his constitution, his history. There is nothing here to suggest anything other than natural causes. Then you will not object my viewing the scene before it is disturbed? Dr. Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. I suppose there can be no harm in it, given that Sir Alister himself invited your consultation yesterday. The body remains in the study as we found it. We entered that ordered chamber to find Sir Alister slumped forward slightly in his chair, his arms resting upon the desk, his head inclined as though he had merely dozed off whilst working. Indeed, there was something almost serene in his posture, a suggestion of peaceful resignation rather than distress. The lamp upon the desk had burned out, its reservoir empty, and a faint smell of spent oil hung in the air. But it was not the body that immediately commanded Holmes's attention. His gaze went at once to the cabinet against the wall, which now stood open, its door ajar by perhaps 6 inches. The lock showed no signs of forcing, the brass handle remained unblemished, yet there was something profoundly wrong about that aperture, as though it represented not merely an opening, but a violation. Holmes approached the cabinet and examined it minutely, producing his lens to study the lock mechanism and the interior of the door. He said nothing, but I observed the intensity of his concentration. After some moments, he turned his attention to the desk itself, noting the position of the blotter, the inkstand, the empty lamp. His fingers hovered over a slight discoloration on the leather desk surface, then moved to examine the position of Sir Alister's hands. Dr. Blackwood, he said, without turning, you mentioned that Sir Alister had been under strain. Of what nature? The usual anxieties of advanced age, questions of legacy, of unfinished business. He had grown increasingly preoccupied in recent weeks. Did he complain of any physical symptoms? Palpitations, breathlessness, pain in the chest or arms? Nothing specific. He was remarkably robust for a man of his years. Holmes moved to examine the interior of the cabinet, which contained several shelves of documents, all neatly arranged. He studied them for some time, occasionally removing a folder to inspect its contents, then replacing it with meticulous care. At length he straightened and turned to face the physician. Where are the other guests who dined here last evening? Miss Pembroke departed for her home in Kensington shortly after the meal. Mr. Carstairs and Mr. Rathbone left together, I believe around 9:30. I myself remained until nearly 10 o'clock, as Sir Alister wished to discuss certain matters of his health. And what time did you discover the body? I did not. Discover it? That unfortunate duty fell to Matthews the manservant when he brought Sir Alister's morning tea at 7 o'clock. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes moving about the room with that peculiar intensity I had come to recognise as the prelude to some significant observation. The household retired at what hour? Matthews reports that he secured the house at 10:30 and retired to his quarters. Sir Alister was accustomed to working late and required no attendance after that hour. And no one heard anything unusual during the night? No sounds of distress, no movement? Nothing whatsoever. Matthews is somewhat deaf, I should mention, and his room is at the rear of the house. At this moment we were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose familiar features showed a mixture of professional duty and genuine regret. He had known Sir Alister slightly through various government matters and seemed genuinely affected by the death. A great loss to the nation, he said after greeting us, though I understand from Dr. Blackwood that there are no suspicious circumstances. That remains to be determined, Holmes replied. I should like to make a more thorough examination before any conclusions are drawn. Lestrade looked surprised, but nodded his assent. For the next hour, Holmes conducted a search of the study with a thoroughness that would have seemed excessive had I not learned to trust his methods absolutely. He examined the windows, finding them locked from within. He studied the door, noting the position of the key which remained in the interior lock. He measured the temperature of the room with a pocket thermometer, noted the state of the fire which had burned out completely, and even examined the underside of the desk with his lens. When at last he straightened, his expression was one I had seen before, a combination of satisfaction and concern that suggested he had found both answers and new questions in equal measure. "Lestrade," he said quietly, "I must ask that this room be sealed, and that no one be permitted to remove anything from it until I have completed my investigation. I must also request that you detain the members of Sir Alister's household and his guests from yesterday for further questioning." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "You suspect foul play, then?" "I suspect a great many things, but I am certain of very few. However, I can tell you this. Sir Alister did not die in the manner that Dr. Blackwood suggests. The position of the body, the state of the room, the opened cabinet, all tell a story that is not consistent with simple cardiac failure." Dr. Blackwood, who had remained silent during Holmes's examination, now stepped forward with evident indignation. "I must protest, Mr. Holmes. I examined Sir Alister myself. There are no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. The man simply expired, as men of his age are wont to do." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his tone mild, but his eyes sharp. "And yet I observe several details that trouble me. The lamp upon this desk has burned itself dry, suggesting that Sir Alister worked late into the night. The cabinet stands open, though yesterday he spoke of it as though it contained documents of the highest sensitivity. And most curious of all, I detect upon the desk surface a faint residue that suggests something was spilled here and subsequently cleaned, though not with complete success." "A drop cup of tea, perhaps," the doctor suggested. "Hardly suspicious." "Perhaps. But I note also that Sir Alister's position, whilst appearing peaceful, is not quite natural for a man who has suffered heart failure. The angle of the head, the placement of the hands, these suggest a body that has been very slightly adjusted after death, arranged to present a particular appearance." "Nonsense," Dr. Blackwood blustered. "I touch nothing. The body is precisely as it was found." "I do not doubt your word, Doctor, but someone touched it, however delicately." "And that someone wished us to believe exactly what we see. A man who died peacefully at his desk." Lestrade had grown increasingly grave during this exchange. "You're suggesting murder, Holmes?" "I am suggesting that we proceed with extreme caution. Sir Alister summoned me here yesterday to witness a gathering of persons who, by his own admission, had reason to fear what his confidential file contained. Now he is dead, the cabinet has been opened, and we must determine whether this is tragic coincidence or calculated design." As if in response to Holmes's words, the manservant Matthews appeared at the door, his aged face troubled. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's Miss Pembroke and Mr. Carstairs arrived, asking to pay their respects, and Mr. Rathbone is waiting in the drawing-room. They heard the news and came at once." Holmes's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a glint of grim satisfaction. "How thoughtful of them," he murmured. "Lestrade, I believe we shall have opportunity to observe these good people in their grief. Watson, your medical eye may prove invaluable. Pay close attention to their reactions, for I suspect that genuine sorrow and performed sorrow will both be on display this morning, and the distinction between them may prove illuminating." We descended to the drawing-room to find that same ordered space now occupied by three figures whose demeanour struck me as peculiarly varied. Miss Pembroke sat rigidly upon the sofa, her face composed, but her hands clenched in her lap with sufficient force to whiten the knuckles. Mr. Carstairs stood by the window, apparently gazing out upon the square, though his shoulders betrayed a tension that suggested his thoughts were far from the scene before him. Mr. Rathbone occupied a chair near the fireplace, his professional mask firmly in place, though I detected in the set of his jaw a grinding tension. As we entered, each turned toward us, and in that moment I witnessed three distinct reactions to our presence. Miss Pembroke's face showed relief, as though she had been braced for something far worse. Carstairs exhibited surprise, perhaps even alarm, as though our appearance was entirely unexpected, and Rathbone merely nodded, his expression carefully neutral, revealing nothing. It was, I thought, a most instructive tableau, though precisely what it instructed I could not yet determine. Holmes, however, surveyed the scene with evident interest, and I knew that each gesture, each expression, each word, spoken or left unspoken, was being catalogued in that extraordinary mind for future reference. The game had grown suddenly darker and the stakes immeasurably higher. Chapter 4: Ink, Paper, and the Language of Avoidance. The remainder of that morning passed in a series of interviews conducted by Holmes with a delicacy that might have surprised those who knew only his reputation for brusque efficiency. He spoke with each of the assembled guests separately, drawing from them ostensibly innocent recollections of the previous evening whilst I observed from a corner of the room, noting not merely their words but the manner of their delivery. Miss Pembroke, when questioned, spoke of her cousin with evident affection tempered by a certain formality, as though their relationship, whilst genuine, had always maintained proper boundaries. She had left the house at 8 o'clock, she insisted, not 9:30 as Dr. Blackwood had suggested, taking a cab directly to her residence in Kensington. Her landlady could confirm the hour of her arrival. Sir Alister seemed in good spirits during dinner, she offered. Perhaps somewhat distracted, but not unwell. He spoke of finalising certain affairs, of putting his house in order, as elderly gentlemen will. I had no reason to suppose he meant anything more significant than the ordinary business of age. "And the confidential file?" Holmes inquired gently. "Did he mention it during the evening?" A shadow crossed her features. "Not directly, but there was an understanding among us all that it was the reason for the gathering. Sir Alister was testing us, I think, though to what purpose I could not say." Mr. Carstairs proved more difficult to read. His manner combined deference with a barely concealed resentment, as though years of subordinate service had left him sensitive to any suggestion of being questioned. He confirmed that he had departed with Mr. Rathbone shortly before 10 o'clock, walking together as far as the corner of Russell Square before parting ways. "Sir Alister owed me nothing," he said, with an edge to his voice. "I served him loyally for 12 years and received fair compensation. If I have fallen upon leaner times since his retirement, that is my own concern and reflects no discredit upon him." "Yet you returned here this morning," Holmes observed. "That suggests some continuing connection." "Common decency, Mr. Holmes. A man does not ignore the death of his former employer, regardless of present circumstances. Mr. Rathbone, when his turn came, spoke with the measured precision of his profession. He described the evening's conversation as cordial but strained, acknowledging that all present were aware of the unspoken subject that hovered over the gathering. Sir Alister was contemplating disclosure, he said bluntly. He did not state it outright, but his meaning was clear. As his solicitor, I advised him of the potential legal complications, but he seemed determined to follow his conscience rather than prudence. And your own interest in the matter? Purely professional, I assure you. The firm has handled Sir Alister's affairs for many years. We should prefer no scandal attached to our client, but the decision was ultimately his to make. It was only after these interviews concluded that Holmes returned to the study, now officially sealed by Lestrade's order, and began the painstaking examination that was to occupy him for the remainder of the day. I joined him there, finding him seated at Sir Alister's desk with a stack of correspondence before him and his lens in hand. "Watson," he said without looking up, "observe these letters. What do you make of them?" I studied the documents he indicated, a series of business letters dating back several months. They appeared entirely ordinary, concerning investments, property matters, and routine legal affairs. I said as much to Holmes. "Look more closely at the dates. Here and here." He indicated 2 letters with his finger. "Do you notice anything unusual?" I examined them with greater care and observed that in each case, the final digit of the year appeared slightly darker than the surrounding text, as though it had been traced over or amended. "The dates have been altered," I said. "Precisely. Someone has changed 94 to 95 in both instances, and with considerable skill. The ink is nearly identical in shade, the penmanship carefully matched, but the paper shows a double impression where the nib has passed twice over the same line. Now observe this ledger. He indicated one of the volumes from the shelves, opening it to a page marked by a slip of paper. The entries were in Sir Alister's meticulous hand, recording various financial transactions, but several lines showed signs of disturbance, the ink slightly smudged, the surface of the paper roughened as though something had been scraped away. "Chemical erasure," Holmes explained. "Someone has used oxalic acid or a similar substance to remove certain entries, then overwritten them with new information. The process is delicate and requires both skill and access. Whoever did this was familiar with Sir Alister's handwriting and had considerable time to work undisturbed." "But why would anyone alter such documents?" I asked. "What purpose could it serve?" "That is the question that troubles me. These alterations are subtle, designed to escape casual notice. They do not change the fundamental character of the documents, but rather obscure certain specific details. Dates are adjusted, initials removed, references rendered deliberately vague. It suggests someone wished to create confusion about timing or responsibility without destroying the documents entirely." Holmes rose and moved to the cabinet, which now stood fully open under Lestrade's examination. "The inspector believes a folder has been removed from this cabinet," he said. He bases this conclusion on a gap in the sequence of files and a faint rectangular outline in the dust where something once rested. "I am inclined to agree, though I note that the missing item left behind something far more interesting than its absence." He reached into the cabinet and withdrew what appeared to be a blank sheet of paper, which he held up to the light from the window. "Observe, Watson. This was lying at the bottom of the shelf beneath where the missing folder would have rested. What do you see?" I examined the paper and detected faint impressions across its surface, as though something written on a sheet above it had pressed through. "Writing," I said, "but too faint to read clearly, yet not too faint to reveal its general character. These are not the careful notes of an official document, but rather hasty annotations, personal comments written in margins or across the face of typed text. Someone has removed the file but overlooked this witness to its contents." He set the paper aside and turned his attention to a smaller drawer within the cabinet, which yielded up a collection of personal correspondence. Among these he discovered a letter that caused him to pause, reading it twice before handing it to me. It was from Miss Pembroke, dated some 6 weeks prior, and its contents were striking. She wrote to her cousin requesting clarification of certain provisions in his will, noting that she had understood herself to be a beneficiary but had received conflicting information from Mr. Rathbone's firm. The tone was polite but carried an undercurrent of anxiety, and she closed by expressing hope that Sir Alister's recent preoccupation with matters best left in the past would not lead him to decisions he might later regret. "Financial motive," I observed. "If she stood to inherit and feared being disinherited, that might explain her nervousness yesterday." "It might indeed," Holmes agreed, "and here we have another suggestive document." He produced a note from Carstairs, more recent still, in which the former secretary requested a loan to cover certain pressing debts. The request was couched in terms of past service and present need, but the desperation was palpable. "So Carstairs needed money and Miss Pembroke feared losing her inheritance," I said. "Either might have reason to prevent Sir Alister from taking any action that could affect their circumstances." "Just so. And Lestrade, I fear, will seize upon these convenient explanations with considerable satisfaction. A jealous cousin, a desperate former employee, perhaps even a solicitor concerned about his firm's reputation. All perfectly rational motives for murder, should murder be proven." "You say that as though you doubt these explanations." Holmes returned to the desk and stood looking down at the spot where Sir Alister had died. "I say it because these motives are too convenient, too readily discovered. The altered documents, the suggestive correspondence, even the missing file all point in obvious directions. Yet Sir Alister himself told us yesterday that the true significance of that file lay not in present concerns, but in events 20 years past. These financial squabbles are mere shadows cast by something far older and darker. Then you believe the alterations were made to create false trails?" I believe they were made by someone who understands the language of official documents, who knows how investigations proceed, and who wishes to ensure that when attention is drawn to these papers, it focuses upon recent events rather than ancient ones. The chemical erasures, the date changes, the carefully planted correspondence all serve to create a narrative of contemporary greed and desperation, whilst concealing a motive rooted in history. He moved to the window and gazed out upon Montague Square, his profile sharp against the afternoon light. Someone in this house yesterday understood that Sir Alister intended to break his silence. Someone knew what that silence had protected and what its breach would destroy. And that someone has been very clever, Watson. Very clever indeed. They have given us a mystery wrapped in ordinary human weakness, hoping we will solve that lesser puzzle and declare ourselves satisfied. But you are not satisfied. Far from it. I am confronted with a death that appears natural but is not, with documents that appear authentic but have been subtly altered, with motives that appear sufficient but are inadequate. I'm being invited to reach certain conclusions whilst the true solution lies in territory I have not yet been permitted to explore. The contents of the missing file, precisely. Until I understand what that file contained, what testimony it preserved, and whom it implicated, I am merely groping in darkness whilst my adversary watches from the light. But I shall illuminate that darkness, Watson. I shall reconstruct what has been destroyed and understand what has been concealed. And when I do, I believe we shall find that this crime is far more subtle and far more terrible than anyone suspects. He turned from the window with sudden decision. Come, we have work to do. Lestrade may pursue his obvious suspects, but we must look deeper. Somewhere in this house, or in the records Sir Alister left behind, there must be some trace of that commission from 20 years ago, some hint of what was suppressed and why. And we must find it before our murderer realizes we are looking in the right direction. As we departed the study, I could not shake the feeling that Holmes had articulated a truth I had only dimly perceived. We were not investigating a simple murder, but rather the eruption of buried history, and the violence we witnessed was merely the visible consequence of wounds inflicted long ago and never properly healed. Chapter 5. A Forgotten Commission. The search for historical records proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Sir Alister's methodical disposition, which had so impressed me upon our first visit, now revealed itself as a double-edged quality. Everything in his possession was organised with such precision that the absence of any material relating to the British Honduras Commission stood out with damning clarity. It was as though an entire category of documentation had been surgically excised from his archives. Holmes, however, was not discouraged. When a man removes all trace of something from his personal effects, he remarked as we travelled by cab toward Whitehall, it suggests not that the matter is forgotten, but that it remains dangerously alive. Sir Alister was preparing for disclosure, Watson. He would not have destroyed the very evidence he intended to reveal. Our destination was the Colonial Office itself, where Holmes's reputation secured us access to the registry of official inquiries. The clerk who attended us, a thin gentleman of indeterminate years, regarded our request with the particular blend of helpfulness and obstruction that characterises government servants everywhere. The British Honduras Commission of 1875, he repeated, consulting a ledger of impressive dimensions. Ah, yes, I have a reference here. Administrative inquiry into allegations of malfeasance within the colonial administration. Commissioners appointed, proceedings conducted, report filed but never published. The matter was resolved through administrative action, and the commission dissolved. All records sealed, under Crown privilege. Yet surely some public record must exist, Holmes pressed. The appointment of commissioners, the terms of reference, the outcome however vaguely stated. The clerk disappeared into an adjoining archive and returned some 20 minutes later with a thin folder of yellow documents. This is all that remains accessible, I'm afraid. The substantive files were transferred to secure storage, and cannot be retrieved without ministerial authority. What he provided was disappointingly sparse. A formal notice of the Commission's establishment, listing 3 commissioners whose names meant nothing to me, a brief statement of the allegations to be investigated, phrased in the deliberately opaque language of official circumspection, and a final notice declaring the matter resolved and the Commission's work concluded. No details, no findings, no hint of what had actually transpired. Holmes studied these documents with intense concentration, committing every detail to memory. "The dates are significant," he murmured. "The Commission sat for 4 months during the summer and autumn of 1875. That places all our principals at crucial moments in their careers. Carstairs would have been a young clerk, perhaps 25, Miss Pembroke in her early 30s serving as companion to someone whose husband sat on the Commission, Blackwood establishing his medical practice, Rathbone newly qualified in law. And Sir Alister himself would have been approaching 50 at the height of his administrative powers, the perfect choice to manage a sensitive inquiry requiring absolute discretion. Holmes folded the documents and returned them to the clerk. "Tell me, is there any record of personnel changes within the Colonial Office following the Commission's work? Dismissals, transfers, resignations?" The clerk consulted another register, running his finger down columns of entries. "Several, actually. Let me see. 3 senior officials retired within 6 months of the Commission's dissolution. 1 junior administrator was transferred to a minor post in West Africa. And there was 1 curious case, a promising young officer named Whitmore, who resigned abruptly and subsequently emigrated to Australia. Rather threw away his career, by all accounts." Holmes's eyes lit with that peculiar intensity that indicated a significant connection had been made. "Whitmore, do you have any further details?" "Only that he had been seconded to British Honduras shortly before the allegations arose. He was recalled to give testimony before the Commission and never returned to colonial service. A great waste, apparently. He had been marked for advancement." As we emerged into the grey afternoon, Holmes walked in silence for some distance, his mind clearly occupied with fitting these new pieces into the emerging pattern. Finally he spoke. "Watson, we are beginning to see the shape of this affair. A promising young officer destroyed, his career ended at its inception. 3 senior officials conveniently retired. And somewhere in this sequence of events, our current suspects played their parts, some as witnesses, others as instruments, perhaps one as the author of Whitmore's downfall. But how does this connect to Sir Alister's death? Through guilt and fear in equal measure. Consider, 20 years have passed, sufficient time for the immediate participants to reach positions of comfort and security. Whitmore is gone, disappeared into Australian obscurity. The senior officials are dead or senile, but the testimony remains, locked away in Sir Alister's cabinet, and with it the power to resurrect old accusations and destroy carefully constructed reputations. We returned to Baker Street to find a telegram awaiting us. It was from Mycroft Holmes, whose position in government gave him access to information far beyond the reach of ordinary inquiry. The message was characteristically terse. "Your commission involved allegations of fraudulent land deals and misappropriation of indigenous holdings. 1 witness recanted testimony, another disappeared. 3rd witness's statement formed basis of Whitmore's dismissal, but was later questioned. Suggest you examine family connections." Holmes read this aloud, then tossed the telegram onto his desk with a gesture of satisfaction. "Mycroft has opened the door a crack, Watson. We need only widen it sufficiently to see what lies beyond." The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Baker Street. It was Mr. Rathbone, the solicitor, who appeared at our door without appointment or announcement. His professional composure had deteriorated markedly since our last meeting. He seemed a man struggling against some internal pressure that threatened to overcome his customary restraint. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I must speak with you in confidence. What I am about to reveal violates client privilege." but I find myself in a position where silence would be a greater sin. Holmes gestured him to a chair and waited with that patient stillness he adopted when a witness was on the verge of significant disclosure. Rathbone drew a deep breath. Sir Alister consulted me 3 weeks ago regarding his will. He wished to make certain amendments, not to the disposition of his property, which remained largely unchanged, but to include a codicil directing his executors to release certain documents to the authorities upon his death. When I asked what documents he referred to, he mentioned the British Honduras Commission. And you advised him against this course? I advised him of the potential complications. The documents were received under conditions of confidentiality. Their release might expose not only the original participants, but also Sir Alister's estate to legal action. But he was adamant. He said he had carried the burden of silence too long and would not take it to his grave. Did he specify what the documents would reveal? Rathbone hesitated, then plunged forward. He said they would prove that testimony given against a young officer named Whitmore was fabricated, that the true culprit in the land frauds had been protected through perjury, and that the Commission's findings had been deliberately falsified to serve political expediency rather than justice. And who was this protected individual? He would not name them directly, but he did say that the person responsible for Whitmore's destruction had prospered greatly in the years since, had built a respectable life upon the foundation of another man's ruin, and that this injustice haunted him more than any other decision of his career. Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Rathbone, I must ask you directly, did Sir Alister indicate whether this person was among the guests assembled at his house 2 days ago? The solicitor's face had grown pale. He said that he had invited everyone connected to the affair, that he wished to give them opportunity to confess before he made the truth public. He believed that faced with imminent exposure, conscience might prevail where it had not done so for 20 years. But conscience did not prevail. No, Mr. Holmes. Instead, Sir Alister is dead, and the file he intended to release has disappeared. I cannot prove murder, but I can no longer pretend that these events are coincidental. After Rathbone departed, Holmes stood by the window in an attitude of deep contemplation. We have our motive at last, Watson. Not greed, not jealousy, but the desperate need to prevent the exposure of an ancient crime. Someone at that dinner table destroyed Whitmore 20 years ago through false testimony. Sir Alister discovered this truth, or perhaps always knew it, and his conscience finally compelled him to act. But which of them could it have been? Miss Pembroke was merely a companion. Carstairs was a junior clerk. Dr. Blackwood attended to witnesses. None of these roles suggest the power to fabricate evidence or influence the Commission's findings. That is precisely the question that must be answered. We know the what and the why. We must now determine the who and the how. And to do that, Watson, we must reconstruct not merely the events of 2 nights ago, but the events of 20 years past. Somewhere in the intersection of those 2 crimes, for the destruction of Whitmore was itself a crime, we shall find our murderer. He turned from the window with sudden decision. Tomorrow we shall interview each of our suspects again, but this time we shall not ask about Sir Alister's death. We shall ask about his life, and specifically about his life in 1875. People may lie about their recent actions with some facility, but their memories of distant events often betray truths they do not intend to reveal. We shall take them back 20 years, Watson, and see which of them cannot bear to make the journey. As I retired that evening, I found myself pondering the peculiar cruelty of time. Events that seemed finished and buried could remain alive beneath the surface, festering like unhealed wounds, until some disturbance brought them erupting back into the present. Sir Alister had died not for what he knew, but for what he intended to reveal, and his murderer was someone who had lived for 2 decades with the knowledge of their own guilt, believing it safely interred in the past. Now that past had become present, and Holmes was determined to drag it fully into the light. Chapter 6. The Weight of Shared Silence. Holmes's plan to interview our suspects about their memories of 1875 was forestalled by an unexpected development. Early the following morning, Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street with news that transformed the investigation from inquiry to active pursuit. "We've had a curious incident at Montague Square," he announced, his features betraying both confusion and a certain professional excitement. "Someone attempted to break into Sir Alister's study last night." Matthews heard sounds around 2 o'clock and raised the alarm. By the time he reached the study, the intruder had fled through the window, which had been forced from outside. Nothing appears to have been taken, as the room was still sealed from our investigation, but it's clear someone was searching for something specific. Holmes received this information with an expression I had come to recognise as suppressed satisfaction. The study window faces onto the rear garden, does it not? And access to that garden is available from the mews behind the house. Precisely. We found marks where someone climbed over the garden wall, footprints in the flower bed, though too indistinct to be of use. Professional work, I'd say. Someone who knows how to move quietly and leave little trace. Or someone desperate enough to take significant risks. Holmes reached for his coat. "Watson, we must return to Montague Square immediately. This attempted burglary tells us several important things, not least that our murderer did not obtain what they sought when they killed Sir Alister. The missing file is still missing, hidden somewhere neither the killer nor we have yet discovered. The study, when we arrived, showed signs of the night's disturbance. The window stood open, its lock cleanly forced with a tool that had left distinctive marks in the brass. A chair had been moved from its position, and several books had been disturbed on the shelves, though the sealed cabinet remained untouched, protected by Lestrade's official seal. Holmes examined the window frame with minute attention, then turned his focus to the room itself, studying it from new angles as though the attempted intrusion had revealed possibilities previously overlooked. He moved slowly along the bookshelves, occasionally removing a volume, examining it and replacing it with care. After perhaps 20 minutes of this methodical search, he paused before a section devoted to works of history and philosophy. "Watson, assist me in removing these books from the shelf. All of them, if you please." We worked together to clear the shelf, stacking the volumes upon the desk. When the space was empty, Holmes ran his hands over the wooden backing, pressing at various points with his fingertips. Suddenly there came a soft click, and a section of the panelling swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow compartment perhaps 18 inches square. Within this space lay a sheaf of papers, yellow with age, their edges crisp with decades of careful storage. Holmes drew them out with the delicacy one might employ with ancient manuscripts and carried them to the desk, where the morning light fell upon them most favourably. "The hidden portion of the file," he said quietly. "Or rather, the original testimony that was subsequently suppressed. Sir Alister preserved it here, separate from the official documents in the cabinet, knowing that anyone searching for the file would look in the obvious place while this remained undiscovered. The papers, when examined, proved to be transcripts of testimony given before the British Honduras Commission. 3 witnesses had provided statements, each typed upon official forms and signed at the bottom. Holmes read through them in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave, while I waited with such patience as I could muster. At length he looked up. "These documents tell a story of systematic corruption, Watson, but more significantly, they tell a story of betrayal. Listen to this." He began to read from the first transcript, the testimony of a minor colonial official named Henderson. "I observed Mr. Whitmore in conversation with representatives of the indigenous landholders on 3 occasions. He appeared sympathetic to their grievances and spoke of bringing their concerns to official attention. I heard him say that the land transfers were improperly documented and might be challenged. This struck me as disloyal to the administration." Holmes set down that page and took up the second. "Now this, from a clerk named Morrison. I can confirm that Mr. Whitmore had access to the files concerning the disputed land sales. On 2 occasions I saw him reviewing these documents after hours. When I asked his purpose, he stated he was conducting an investigation at the direction of his superiors, though I subsequently learned this was false. He appeared to be removing certain papers, though I cannot swear to this with certainty. Both accounts suggest Whitmore was acting improperly, I observed. They suggest it, yes, but note the careful phrasing. Henderson reports only that Whitmore was sympathetic and spoke of raising concerns, actions entirely proper for a conscientious officer. Morrison admits he cannot swear Whitmore removed anything. These are testimonies crafted to create suspicion through implication, while stating nothing definitively incriminating. He took up the third, transcript, and I saw his expression harden. But this final testimony is of a different character entirely. It is from Dr. Theodore Blackwood, giving evidence in his capacity as medical attendant to several indigenous witnesses who were to testify before the commission. Holmes read, "I must report with great regret that several of the indigenous witnesses appeared to have been coached in their testimony. They exhibited signs of nervousness inconsistent with simple anxiety, and their statements showed an unnatural uniformity of phrasing. Moreover, I observed Mr. Whitmore in private conversation with these witnesses on the evening before they were to give evidence. While I cannot prove improper influence was exerted, the circumstances aroused my professional suspicion. I felt it my duty to report these observations, as they bear upon the reliability of the testimony these witnesses would provide." The silence that followed was profound. Holmes set down the paper and looked at me, with an expression of grim understanding. "Do you see, Watson? Blackwood's testimony was the killing blow. Henderson and Morrison created an atmosphere of suspicion, but Blackwood provided what appeared to be objective, professional evidence of actual misconduct. A doctor's word carries weight. If he testified that Whitmore had been improperly influencing witnesses, the commission would have no choice but to investigate." But was it false testimony? Read the next page. It is a handwritten note, not part of the official transcript, in Sir Alister's hand. I took the paper he offered and read the cramped writing. Dr. Blackwood's testimony received after the indigenous witnesses had already given evidence. His observations, if accurate, should have been reported immediately. The delay suggests coordination with other testimony against Whitmore. Moreover, subsequent investigation revealed that the witnesses in question had been interviewed by Blackwood only once, briefly, and that his characterization of their nervousness and uniformity could not be substantiated by others present. I believe Blackwood's testimony was designed to discredit both Whitmore and the indigenous witnesses he was assisting, thereby protecting the true perpetrators of the land frauds. Sir Alister knew, I breathed. He knew the testimony was fabricated. He knew, or came to know, but by then the commission had concluded and Whitmore was destroyed. The political considerations that dictated a quiet resolution prevented any later correction. The innocent was sacrificed, the guilty protected, and the truth buried. Holmes gathered the papers together with careful precision. But now we must ask ourselves, why did Blackwood give false testimony? What possible motive could he have had to destroy a man he barely knew? He fell silent, his fingers drumming upon the desk in that characteristic manner that indicated intensive thought. Then quite suddenly he returned to the hidden compartment and felt carefully within its depths. His hand emerged holding a final document, a single page folded small and pressed into the corner where it might easily have been overlooked. This proved to be a letter, dated December 1875, addressed to Sir Alister. Holmes read it aloud. "My dear Pembroke, I write to you in strictest confidence regarding the matter we discussed. The situation with young Whitmore has been resolved as you suggested, though I confess the means trouble my conscience. Henderson and Morrison have played their parts adequately, but it was Blackwood's medical testimony that proved decisive. He understood what was required without being told explicitly, a discretion for which I am grateful. The land transactions will now proceed without further interference, and the parties whose interests were threatened have expressed their satisfaction. Your cousin sends her regards and wishes me to convey her gratitude for your assistance in this delicate matter. She understands that her husband's position on the commission placed him in an awkward situation, and your intervention has resolved it admirably. Yours, etc., A. Pemberton. Holmes set down the letter and met my astonished gaze. Pemberton was one of the commissioners, he said, and Sir Alister's cousin Lavinia was companion to Mrs. Pemberton. The connection is now clear. Pemberton was involved in the land frauds, either directly or through associates whose interests he was protecting. When Whitmore began investigating, Pemberton was threatened with exposure. Sir Alister, protecting his cousin's position, arranged for false testimony to be given. Blackwood obliged, perhaps for payment, perhaps for favours to come. And the others, Carstairs and Rathbone, were witnesses to these arrangements, conspirators perhaps in lesser degree but complicit nonetheless. They knew what had been done, knew that Whitmore was innocent and kept silent. For 20 years they have all kept silent, bound together by shared guilt. Holmes stood and moved to the window, gazing out upon the garden where the intruder had made his escape. Now we understand the atmosphere at that dinner table, Watson. Sir Alister had assembled not merely witnesses to his past, but accomplices in a great injustice. He was offering them a choice: confess now and face the consequences with what dignity remained, or wait for him to make the truth public and be exposed as the cowards they were. But one of them chose a third option. Precisely. One of them decided that the only way to ensure continued silence was to silence Sir Alister permanently and recover the evidence of their guilt. They came to dinner knowing his intentions, left with the others to establish their alibis, and then returned by some means to commit murder. But which of them Holmes? All four had motive. All four had motive to wish Sir Alister silent, yes, but only one had the specific knowledge and capability to accomplish his death in the manner employed. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall conduct a small experiment. I shall arrange for our suspects to be gathered once more, and this time I shall test not their memories, but their reactions to the truth. For I believe I now understand not only why Sir Alister died, but how and by whose hand. As we departed Montague Square, I reflected upon the strange justice Holmes sought to achieve. We were investigating not one crime, but two: a murder committed 2 days past, and a character assassination committed 20 years ago. The latter had set in motion the former, and both must be solved if any justice was to be done. The past, as Holmes had remarked, was never truly dead. It merely waited for the right moment to demand its reckoning. Chapter 7. The tempting but false solution. The discovery of the hidden testimony had provided Holmes with motive, but he remained unsatisfied. I observed him throughout the remainder of that day conducting a series of seemingly unrelated experiments in our Baker Street lodgings, measuring intervals of time with his watch, testing the drying properties of various inks, and examining under his lens the samples of paper he had obtained from Sir Alister's study. He refused to explain these activities, responding to my inquiries with only the vaguest of assurances that all would become clear in due course. It was Lestrade who, the following morning, arrived with news that appeared to resolve the case entirely. He entered our rooms with the satisfied air of a man who has pursued his investigation to a successful conclusion, and found his professional judgment vindicated. "I believe we have our man, Holmes," he announced, settling himself into the basket chair with evident pleasure. "Young Carstairs, the secretary. The evidence has been mounting steadily, and this morning we discovered the final piece that makes the case complete." Holmes, who had been examining a timetable from the Underground Railway, set it aside with an expression of polite interest. "Indeed, you interest me greatly, Lestrade. Pray share your evidence." "Gladly. To begin with, Carstairs had both motive and opportunity. We've established that he was in desperate financial circumstances, owing money to several creditors and facing potential bankruptcy. Sir Alister's death would not benefit him directly through inheritance, but we've now learned that he had been attempting to sell certain information to a newspaper regarding scandals in the Colonial Office. He needed Sir Alister dead before the old gentleman could publicly release his own account, which would have rendered Carstairs' information worthless. "An interesting theory," Holmes remarked. but surely rather elaborate. How would killing Sir Alistair improve Carstairs' financial position if the information he possessed was indeed worthless? Because he also stole the confidential file, don't you see? We found evidence that Carstairs visited Montague Square on at least 3 occasions in the weeks before the murder, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for his master's papers. He had ample opportunity to study the locks, to understand the household routine, and to plan his crime. You mentioned a final piece of evidence. Lestrade leaned forward with unmistakable triumph. This morning we executed a search warrant on Carstairs' lodgings in Bloomsbury. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom, we found a set of lockpicks and a small bottle of liquid that our chemist has identified as a powerful sedative. The same substance, I might add, that our medical examiner now believes was administered to Sir Alistair to ensure he remained unconscious while the killer staged the scene. I confess this revelation struck me forcibly. The pieces seemed to align with damning precision. Motive, opportunity, and now physical evidence directly linking Carstairs to the means of murder. Even Holmes appeared momentarily arrested by this information, though his expression remained thoughtfully neutral. "Has Carstairs been arrested?" he inquired. "He's being brought to Scotland Yard as we speak. I came here first out of professional courtesy, knowing your interest in the case. We shall have his confession before nightfall, mark my words. The man's guilt is written in every circumstance." After Lestrade departed, I turned to Holmes with a sense of deflation. "It appears your experiments may have been unnecessary after all. The case against Carstairs seems overwhelming." "It does indeed," Holmes agreed, but his tone carried an odd quality that caused me to look at him more closely. "It possesses that rare perfection of form that should satisfy even the most exacting investigator. Motive, means, and opportunity, all neatly packaged and presented for acceptance." "You sound sceptical." "I am sceptical, Watson, though I confess I cannot yet articulate the precise nature of my doubt. The case against Carstairs is too complete, too carefully constructed. Real crimes are messy affairs, full of loose ends and inexplicable details. This has been trimmed and shaped until it resembles not reality but a particularly neat fiction." He rose and began to pace, his hands thrust into his pockets. "Consider the timeline that Lestrade's theory requires. Carstairs leaves Montague Square at approximately 9:45 in the evening, walking with Rathbone as far as Russell Square. They part ways at 10 o'clock. Carstairs must then return to Montague Square, gain entry to the house without alerting the household, administer the sedative to Sir Alistair, arrange the body, open the cabinet, steal the file, and depart again, all before Matthew secures the house at 10:30. Surely that is possible? Possible, but consider the implications. Carstairs would have had perhaps 30 minutes to accomplish all of this. Yet the lamp upon Sir Alistair's desk burned itself dry, suggesting he worked late into the night. How could Carstairs know that Sir Alistair would remain in his study at that precise hour? How could he be certain of finding him alone and vulnerable? Perhaps he watched the house and took his opportunity when it presented itself. Then why leave with Rathbone at all? Why not linger near the house from the beginning? Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, the timing is wrong. But there is something else that troubles me even more." He moved to his desk and retrieved several sheets of paper covered with his neat notations. "I have been conducting experiments regarding the altered documents we discovered in Sir Alistair's study. The chemical erasures, the overwritten dates, the smudged initials. These modifications were made with considerable skill and required both time and privacy to execute properly. Surely Carstairs had ample opportunity during his visits to the house. So one would assume, but observe, the alterations were made using oxalic acid for the erasures and a specific formulation of iron gall ink for the overwrites. I obtained samples of various inks yesterday and tested their drying properties under different conditions of temperature and humidity. The documents we examined showed evidence of having been altered in sequence, not all at once, with each modification allowed to dry completely before the next was undertaken. He spread before me a detailed chart showing his experimental results. Based on the absorption rate of the paper, the ambient temperature of Sir Alister's study, and the sequence of modifications, I calculate that the alterations must have been made over a period of at least 4 days, possibly as many as 6. Furthermore, the work could only have been done during daylight hours, as the colour matching required natural light to achieve the precision we observed. But Carstairs visited the house several times in recent weeks. He did, but never for more than an hour at a time, according to Matthews's testimony, and never, I might add, when Sir Alister was absent from the study. The old gentleman was meticulous about his papers, and would not have permitted his former secretary to handle them unsupervised. No, Watson, whoever altered those documents had extended private access to the study under circumstances that aroused no suspicion. I began to perceive the direction of his reasoning. Then Carstairs could not have made the alterations. The timeline makes it extremely improbable, but there is a further difficulty with Lestrade's theory. The sedative found in Carstairs' lodgings, did you note how conveniently it was discovered? Hidden beneath a floorboard where any competent search would inevitably find it. A man clever enough to commit this murder would surely dispose of such damning evidence rather than preserve it in so obvious a location. You think it was planted? I think it was provided. Someone wished Carstairs to appear guilty, and that someone had both the means and the knowledge to accomplish the framing. Consider, who would know to include lockpicks and sedative as the essential implements of this particular crime? Who would understand what evidence the police would find most convincing? Before I could respond, there came a knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a messenger bearing a note from Inspector Lestrade. Holmes read it, then handed it to me with a grim smile. The message was brief. Carstairs has confessed to the theft of the file, but absolutely denies the murder. He claims he returned to Montague Square the night after Sir Alister's death, and broke into the study to steal the documents, believing them valuable to his newspaper scheme, maintains he found Sir Alister already dead and the cabinet already opened, insists on his innocence of the actual killing. What say you? L. A convenient confession to the lesser crime, I observed, while denying the greater. Or an honest admission from a man who committed theft but not murder. Holmes stood and reached for his coat. We must go to Scotland Yard immediately, Watson. Lestrade has arrested the wrong man, and while he wastes time attempting to extract a false confession, the true murderer is congratulating himself on a deception most successfully executed. But Holmes, if not Carstairs, then who? You have eliminated the only suspect with clear opportunity and demonstrable means. I have eliminated the obvious suspect, Watson, which is precisely why I now see clearly who the guilty party must be. The murderer required extended access to Sir Alister's study, intimate knowledge of his habits, professional expertise to administer the fatal substance without detection, and the intelligence to construct a false trail that would lead us toward Carstairs while concealing their own involvement. You mean? I mean that we have been investigating this crime from the wrong direction entirely. We have been asking who could have committed the murder, when we should have been asking who could have arranged for it to appear as natural death. And there is only one person among our suspects whose profession provides both the knowledge and the means to accomplish such a deception. As we descended to the street and hailed a cab, I felt that peculiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that always attended Holmes's investigations at their crucial juncture. He had seen through Lestrade's neat solution to perceive a far more subtle crime, and I knew that the revelation, when it came, would illuminate not merely the method, but the entire character of the murderer we sought. The game, which had seemed concluded, was in fact only now reaching its decisive moment. Chapter 8. The Experiment of Memory. Holmes's insistence upon Carstairs' innocence met with considerable resistance at Scotland Yard. Lestrade, having constructed what he believed to be an unassailable case, was understandably reluctant to abandon it, on the basis of what he termed theoretical considerations about ink and timing. It required nearly 2 hours of patient argument, supported by Holmes's experimental data and a careful reconstruction of the timeline before the inspector grudgingly agreed to postpone any formal charges. "But if not Carstairs," Lestrade demanded with evident frustration, "then who? You cannot simply eliminate suspects without providing an alternative. I have superiors who require results, Holmes, not philosophical speculation about the nature of evidence." "I require one more day," Holmes replied. "Tomorrow evening I shall gather all parties concerned at Montague Square, and demonstrate not only who committed this murder, but precisely how it was accomplished. Until then, I ask only that you maintain surveillance on our remaining suspects and prevent any of them from departing London. And if your demonstration fails, then you may proceed against Carstairs with my blessing, though I warn you that a competent barrister will dismantle your case within an hour of trial. But it will not fail, Lestrade. I have one final test to conduct, and I am confident it will prove decisive." The following day was spent in careful preparation. Holmes dispatched several telegrams, consulted with a chemist of his acquaintance in Montague Street, and made a mysterious visit to the British Museum reading room, from which he returned with a notebook filled with cramped annotations. When I inquired as to the purpose of these activities, he merely smiled and assured me that all would become apparent at the proper moment. That evening found us once again at number 14, Montague Square, where Holmes had arranged for the assembly of all persons connected to the case. Miss Pembroke arrived first, her manner combining apprehension with a certain defiant dignity, as though she had steeled herself to face whatever accusations might be levelled. Mr. Rathbone came shortly after, his professional composure intact, but his eyes betraying deep unease. Dr. Blackwood was the last to arrive, his florid features arranged in an expression of puzzled concern, protesting that he could not understand why his presence was required at what he termed a theatrical display. Carstairs was present as well, having been released on Holmes's recognizance, though he sat somewhat apart from the others, still under the shadow of Lestrade's suspicions. The inspector himself occupied a position near the door, his notebook ready, his expression sceptical but attentive. Holmes began without preamble, standing before the fireplace in an attitude that reminded me of a lecturer addressing students. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have asked you here this evening because I believe we have all been labouring under a fundamental misapprehension regarding Sir Alister Pembroke's death. We have been seeking a murderer who acted from contemporary motives, when in fact we should have been seeking someone whose crime lies 2 decades in the past." This pronouncement caused a visible stir among the assembled company. Miss Pembroke's hand moved to her throat, Rathbone shifted in his seat, and Dr. Blackwood's face darkened with what might have been either anger or fear. "I have recovered," Holmes continued, "certain documents that Sir Alister had preserved in secret. These documents relate to the British Honduras Commission of 1875 and contain testimony that was subsequently suppressed. I do not propose to read these testimonies aloud, as they concern matters of considerable delicacy and involve persons now dead, but I wish to share with you my understanding of what they reveal." He paused, allowing the tension to build, then proceeded in measured tones. The commission was convened to investigate allegations of land fraud within the colonial administration. A young officer named Whitmore had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption and was preparing to testify. To prevent this exposure, false testimony was arranged by several parties, each acting from different motives but united in their desire to protect certain powerful interests. "This is ancient history," Dr. Blackwood interjected. "What possible bearing can it have on Sir Alister's death?" "Patience, Doctor. I am coming to that." Holmes's eyes swept across his audience. The false testimony destroyed Whitmore's career and reputation. He was dismissed from the colonial service and eventually emigrated to Australia, where he lived in obscurity until his death some years ago. The true perpetrators of the fraud were never exposed, and those who had given false testimony prospered in the years that followed. He moved to the desk where he had arranged several papers. Now, Sir Alister preserved not only the testimony itself, but also certain correspondence that revealed how this conspiracy was orchestrated. I have here a letter that makes clear the mechanism of the plot. Shall I read the relevant passage? Before. He could do so, Miss Pembroke spoke, her voice strained. Mr. Holmes, if you possess such documents, surely they should be delivered to the proper authorities, rather than displayed before a private gathering. In due course they shall be. But first I wish to test my understanding of their contents. You see, the documents I recovered were damaged by time and handling. Certain crucial passages have become illegible, and I have been forced to rely upon inference and reconstruction to fill the gaps. It is possible I have misunderstood some details. He lifted one of the papers as though examining it. For instance, this letter references the arrangement of false testimony, but does not specify who actually approached Dr. Blackwood with the request that he testify against Whitmore. I have concluded, based on the context, that it must have been Commissioner Pemberton himself, acting through an intermediary. Am I correct in this supposition? There was a moment of profound silence, then Dr. Blackwood spoke, his voice sharp with indignation. That's nonsense, Holmes. Pemberton never approached me directly. It was his wife who made the request through Miss Lavinia here. She explained that the family's reputation was at stake and appealed to my sense of loyalty as their physician. The effect of these words was electric. Miss Pembroke uttered a small cry of dismay. Rathbone half rose from his chair, and even Lestrade looked startled. But Holmes merely nodded, as though the doctor had confirmed precisely what he had expected to hear. "How very interesting," he said softly. "You are quite certain it was Mrs. Pemberton who approached you through Miss Pembroke, not the Commissioner himself?" Dr. Blackwood's face had begun to show signs of comprehension dawning, but he could not now retract what he had said. Yes, that is my recollection. But how does this matter now? The woman has been dead these 15 years. It matters, Holmes replied, because the letter I hold makes no mention of Mrs. Pemberton's involvement. Indeed, it suggests quite clearly that the entire arrangement was conducted through male intermediaries, with the ladies of the household kept entirely ignorant of the conspiracy. Yet you, Dr. Blackwood, have just provided details about Mrs. Pemberton's role that could only be known to someone who was directly involved in the events themselves. The doctor's florid complexion had grown notably paler. I may have confused the details. It was 20 years ago, after all. On the contrary, your memory is remarkably precise. You recall not only who approached you, but through whom the approach was made. You remember details that no innocent party would have retained for 2 decades. And that, Doctor, is because these events were not peripheral to your life, but central to it. You did not simply give false testimony at the request of others. You were an active participant in constructing the conspiracy itself. Holmes moved to stand directly before the physician. I suspected as much from the beginning, but I could not prove it until this moment. You see, I deliberately introduced an error into my account of the letter's contents. The document makes no mention of how you were approached because it was written before your testimony was secured. It records only the intention to seek your cooperation. Yet you immediately corrected my supposed mistake with information that could only have come from your own direct knowledge of events. Dr. Blackwood rose from his chair, his manner now openly defensive. This is mere sophistry, Holmes. Even if I recall more details than you expected, it proves nothing about Sir Alister's death. Does it not? Consider your position, Doctor. You alone among these assembled persons possessed the medical knowledge to kill Sir Alister in a manner that would appear natural. You alone had routine access to his person without arousing suspicion. You alone could administer a fatal substance, and then, as his attending physician, declare the death to be from natural causes. And you alone had reason to fear not merely the exposure of your false testimony, but the revelation of your central role in orchestrating Whitmore's destruction. Holmes turned to address the room at large. Gentlemen, Miss Pembroke, I put it to you that Dr. Blackwood murdered Sir Alister Pembroke because he knew that the confidential file would reveal him not as a minor participant in an old conspiracy, but as one of its principal architects. He could not allow that truth to emerge, for it would destroy not merely his reputation, but his entire life's work as a respected physician. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Blackwood stood trembling with what might have been rage or fear or some combination of both. Then, quite suddenly, he collapsed back into his chair, his face in his hands. "You cannot prove it," he said, his voice muffled. "You have cleverly trapped me into revealing knowledge I should not possess, but that is not evidence of murder. There are no witnesses, no physical proof, nothing that would stand up in court." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his tone now almost gentle, "I have considerable proof, which I shall now proceed to demonstrate. But first, I wanted you to understand that I knew. I wanted you to feel the weight of your guilt acknowledged, as Whitmore must have felt the weight of false accusations he could not answer. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Doctor. It merely waits for the proper moment to assert itself." He glanced at Lestrade, who had risen from his chair with notebook in hand, then back at the broken figure of Dr. Blackwood. "Now, if you will permit me, I shall explain exactly how you accomplished this murder, and why, despite your considerable skill, you left behind evidence sufficient to ensure your conviction." The experiment had succeeded, and the mask that Dr. Blackwood had worn for 20 years had finally been torn away. Chapter 9. The Past as the Only Motive. Holmes moved to the desk and from his pocket withdrew a small glass vial containing a clear liquid. He held it up to the lamplight where it gleamed with innocent transparency. "This," he said, "is a solution of aconite, commonly known as wolfsbane or monkshood. In precise dosage, it produces symptoms remarkably similar to cardiac failure: irregular heartbeat, difficulty breathing, numbness of the extremities, and eventually cessation of the heart itself. Death appears entirely natural, particularly in an elderly patient with no prior history of the poison's characteristic effects. A physician examining such a death would find nothing to suggest foul play unless he were specifically looking for it." Dr. Blackwood had raised his head, and now stared at the vial with an expression I could not quite interpret. Holmes continued, his voice taking on that lecturing quality he adopted when explicating a particularly complex problem. "Aconite has several properties that recommend it to the medical poisoner. It is derived from a plant commonly grown in English gardens, making it easily obtainable without arousing suspicion. It is nearly tasteless when properly diluted, and crucially, it metabolizes rapidly in the body, leaving little trace unless the examiner knows to test specifically for alkaloid compounds. A routine post-mortem, such as the one you yourself would have conducted or supervised, Doctor, would reveal nothing suspicious." "You're speaking theoretically," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Any physician might know these facts. They prove nothing." "True enough. So let us proceed from the general to the particular." Holmes set down the vial and took up a sheet of notes. "Sir Alister died sometime between the hours of 10:30 in the evening, when Matthews secured the house, and 7 o'clock the following morning when his body was discovered. The lamp upon his desk had burned itself dry, suggesting he worked late into the night. Yet you, Doctor, told us that you departed at 10 o'clock, a full half hour before the house was locked. As I did, Matthews can confirm it. Matthews can confirm that you departed through the front door at approximately that hour. Yes. But can he confirm that you did not return? The elderly gentleman is, by your own testimony, somewhat deaf, and retires to quarters at the rear of the house. Would he have heard someone entering through the study window, particularly if that someone knew the household's routines and could move with the confidence of intimate familiarity? Holmes gestured toward the window through which the attempted burglary had occurred. When I examined this window frame the morning after Carstairs' intrusion, I observed something curious. The lock bore 2 distinct sets of marks. The first were fresh and crude, clearly made by Carstairs' clumsy picking of the mechanism. But beneath these were older marks, finer and more skilled, suggesting the lock had been defeated previously by someone with greater expertise. "Speculation," Blackwood muttered, though with diminishing conviction. "Then let us consider the matter of access and opportunity more closely. You remained with Sir Alister until 10 o'clock on the evening of his death. ostensibly discussing matters of his health. What health matters precisely? The man was robust for his age, suffering from no chronic condition requiring extended consultation. Yet you lingered for more than an hour after the other guests had departed. Why? When Blackwood did not respond, Holmes supplied the answer himself. You were waiting for the household to settle, for Matthews to complete his evening duties and retire, waiting for the moment when you could depart openly through the front door, thereby establishing your alibi, and then return covertly through the study window which you had earlier unlocked from within during one of your many professional visits to the house. Miss Pembroke spoke for the first time since Blackwood's self-incriminating revelation. But surely someone would have seen him return. The square is not so deserted at that hour. An excellent point, Holmes acknowledged. But consider Dr. Blackwood's practice. His consulting rooms are located in Wimpole Street, a mere 10 minutes' walk from Montague Square. A physician returning to attend an emergency call would excite no particular notice. Indeed, his presence in the neighbourhood at any hour could be easily explained. And if he were observed entering through the front door again, he need only claim that Sir Alister had summoned him for some sudden complaint. But he did not enter through the front door, Lestrade interjected, following the logic, because Matthews had already locked it and retired. Precisely. So Dr. Blackwood returned on foot, entered through the garden from the mews, and climbed through the window he had earlier prepared. He found Sir Alister working at his desk as expected. Perhaps there was some conversation, some final attempt to dissuade the old gentleman from his intended course. We shall never know the exact words spoken, but at some point the doctor administered the poison. Holmes paused, and when he continued, his voice had grown softer, almost reflective. The administration itself was simplicity. A physician visiting a patient often carries medications, a small glass of water or wine, a supposed tonic or sedative to help Sir Alister sleep after the strain of the evening's gathering. The old gentleman trusted his doctor implicitly, and would have consumed it without question. Within minutes, he would have felt the first symptoms: numbness in the lips, a sense of heaviness in the limbs. He may have realised what was happening, or he may have believed it was merely the sudden onset of a natural complaint. Either way, he was soon unable to summon help. The room had grown very still. Even Blackwood sat motionless, his gaze fixed upon some point beyond our vision. Dr. Blackwood waited, Holmes continued. Waited while the poison took its inevitable effect. Waited while Sir Alister's heart grew irregular and finally stopped. And then, with the methodical care of his profession, he arranged the scene. The body was positioned to suggest a man who had simply expired while working. The desktop was tidied, papers arranged as though Sir Alister had been engaged in routine correspondence, and then came the crucial act, opening the cabinet and removing the confidential file. But how did he open the cabinet? I asked, suddenly struck by this detail. The lock showed no signs of forcing. Because Sir Alister himself opened it, Watson. At some point during the evening, either during the doctor's first visit or during their final confrontation, Sir Alister went to the cabinet, unlocked it, and retrieved the file. Perhaps he was preparing to show it to Dr. Blackwood, offering one last opportunity for confession. Perhaps he was merely reviewing its contents before making his final decision regarding disclosure. But the cabinet was opened with the proper key, and the file was removed. Holmes turned back to Blackwood. You took the file, Doctor, believing that with it gone and Sir Alister dead your secret would remain buried. But you made several errors, small ones, but ultimately fatal to your scheme. First, you slightly adjusted Sir Alister's position to make it appear more natural, but in doing so you left evidence that the body had been moved after death. The angle of the head, the placement of the hands, these were not quite consistent with a man who had expired spontaneously. Second, you cleaned the desk surface where you had placed the glass containing the poison, but your cleaning was imperfect. A faint residue remained, detectable to chemical analysis. Third, and most damningly, you made the alterations to Sir Alister's documents over the course of your many visits to this house, believing that by creating false trails pointing toward contemporary motives, you would distract any investigation from the true historical cause. Holmes produced another paper from his collection. But the alterations themselves betrayed you. They required extended access, privacy, and familiarity with Sir Alister's handwriting. Only someone who visited regularly, whose presence aroused no suspicion, and who had professional reason to spend time alone in the study could have accomplished them. Matthews testified that you often worked in this room while Sir Alister rested, reviewing his medical history and making notes. During those hours, you made the alterations, carefully and methodically constructing your elaborate misdirection. And finally, there is the matter of the missing file itself. Carstairs did indeed break into the house the night after the murder and attempted to steal documents, but he found the cabinet already opened and the confidential file already gone. He took other papers, hoping they might be valuable, but the crucial evidence had already been removed. Yet despite your care in disposing of the file, you overlooked the hidden testimony behind the bookcase panel. Sir Alister had created a backup, insurance against the very eventuality that came to pass. Dr. Blackwood had slumped in his chair, all fight apparently drained from him. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Whitmore was going to destroy innocent people with his righteous crusade. The land deals were complicated, yes, but not criminal. He couldn't understand the political necessities, the compromises required to govern effectively. Someone had to stop him. So you stopped him, Holmes said quietly. You gave false testimony that destroyed his career and reputation. You condemned an innocent man to exile and obscurity because it was politically convenient, and when Sir Alister's conscience finally demanded that this injustice be acknowledged, you silenced him as well rather than face the consequences of your actions. I built a respectable practice, Blackwood said, almost to himself. I have served my patients faithfully for 40 years. I have saved lives, relieved suffering, earned the trust of hundreds of families. Was all of that to be destroyed because of one mistake made in youth? It was not a mistake, Doctor. It was a choice, deliberately made and long sustained. And now you have compounded it with murder. Holmes's voice was stern but not unkind. Sir Alister understood the weight of guilt carried across decades. He sought to unburden himself, to make what amends were possible for past wrongs. You chose instead to add another death to your conscience rather than face honest reckoning. Lestrade had moved forward, his handcuffs ready. Dr. Theodore Blackwood, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Alister Pembroke. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be used in evidence against you. As the inspector took Blackwood into custody, the doctor looked at Holmes with an expression of weary resignation. How did you know? What evidence actually proves any of this? You have built an elegant theory, Mr. Holmes, but where is your proof? Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope. This morning I had the chemist analyse samples of residue taken from Sir Alister's desk and from the glass found in his study sideboard. Both tested positive for aconite alkaloids. Furthermore, I made inquiries at several botanical suppliers in London and discovered that you purchased wolfsbane root 3 months ago, ostensibly for the preparation of a liniment. The dosage you extracted would have been more than sufficient to produce the effect we observed. He paused, then added with quiet finality, But the true proof, Doctor, was in your own words tonight. You revealed knowledge that only the guilty could possess, correcting details about events you should barely remember. The past is indeed unforgiving, as Sir Alister discovered. It requires acknowledgement, and it will eventually exact its price. As Blackwood was led away, the remaining persons in the room sat in stunned silence, each contemplating the revelation of how decades of buried guilt had finally erupted into violence. The case was concluded, but I sensed that its implications would linger long after the official proceedings had ended. Chapter 10 of Files Closed and Time Unforgiving. The trial of Dr. Theodore Blackwood proceeded with that peculiar swiftness which attends cases where the evidence is overwhelming and the defendant's spirit already broken. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Sir Alister Pembroke, sparing the court the necessity of a lengthy prosecution, and sparing himself, perhaps, the public excoriation that a full trial would have entailed. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the prisoner's advanced age and previous good character, yet observed that the calculated nature of the crime and its roots in a still earlier betrayal left little room for leniency. Dr. Blackwood was sentenced to penal servitude for life, a term that, given his years, amounted to a death sentence by another name. I attended the sentencing, though Holmes did not. He had completed his work when Blackwood was arrested and saw no purpose in witnessing the machinery of justice grind to its inevitable conclusion. When I returned to Baker Street that afternoon, I found him seated in his armchair, wreathed in the smoke of his pipe, staring into the fire with that abstracted expression which suggested his mind had already moved beyond the immediate case to contemplate its larger implications. "It is finished, then," he said, without turning as I entered. It was a statement rather than a question. "It is finished," I confirmed, settling into my own chair. "Life imprisonment." The judge was quite severe in his remarks regarding the abuse of professional trust. As well he might be. A physician who murders his patient violates the most fundamental compact of his profession. But tell me, Watson, did Blackwood show any remorse? I considered the question carefully, recalling the broken figure who had stood in the dock. He showed something, Holmes, though whether it was true remorse or merely regret at being caught, I cannot say with certainty. He spoke briefly before sentencing, acknowledging his guilt and expressing sorrow for Sir Alister's death. But he said nothing of Whitmore, nothing of the original crime that set all this in motion. "Because he still does not see it as a crime," Holmes replied. In his mind, the false testimony against Whitmore was a necessary expedient, a small sacrifice made for larger political purposes. Only the murder troubles his conscience, and even that primarily because it failed to achieve its intended purpose. He killed Sir Alister to preserve his reputation, and instead he has ensured its permanent destruction. And the others? Miss Pembroke, Carstairs, Rathbone, what becomes of them? Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. Carstairs has been charged with burglary and attempted theft, relatively minor offences for which he will likely receive a short sentence. Miss Pembroke and Rathbone were accessories after the fact to the original conspiracy against Whitmore, but the passage of 20 years makes prosecution impractical, if not impossible. They will live with their knowledge of complicity, which is perhaps punishment enough, but hardly justice. Justice is a relative concept, Watson. Perfect justice would require undoing the past, restoring Whitmore to the career he should have had, compensating him for 20 years of unearned disgrace. Since we cannot achieve that, we must content ourselves with the partial justice of truth, acknowledged and guilt exposed. The confidential file, or what remains of it, has been submitted to the Colonial Office. A quiet inquiry will be conducted, conclusions will be drawn, and perhaps in some dusty official report, Whitmore's name will be cleared for the benefit of any who care to examine the historical record. A cold comfort for a dead man, but more than he had yesterday, and perhaps his descendants in Australia, if any exist, will learn that their ancestor was not the corrupt official he was portrayed to be, but rather a man who paid dearly for attempting to serve justice in circumstances that preferred convenience. We sat in silence for a time, watching the flames dance in the grate. The case had disturbed me more than I cared to admit, perhaps because it struck at the foundations of professional trust that I, as a medical man myself, held sacred. That a physician could betray his calling so completely, first through false testimony and later through murder, seemed to me a violation of something fundamental and irreplaceable. Holmes, as though reading my thoughts, spoke again. "You're troubled by Blackwood's profession, Watson. You see in his actions a stain upon medicine itself. Can I see it otherwise? He used his medical knowledge not to heal, but to kill, and with such calculation that the death appeared natural. How many other patients might he have dispatched over the years? The thought is monstrous. Yet I believe, paradoxically, that his other patients were safe. Blackwood was not a casual murderer. He killed Sir Alister because that particular death served a specific purpose, the preservation of a secret upon which his entire life had been constructed. Had Sir Alister been any other patient, Blackwood would have attended him faithfully and honestly. It was the conjunction of threatened exposure and professional access that created the conditions for murder. That hardly absolves him. I do not mean to absolve him. I merely observe that evil actions do not necessarily proceed from evil natures. Blackwood was a capable physician who, 40 years ago, made a choice that he believed to be expedient. That choice required him to give false testimony against an innocent man. Having made that choice, he spent decades building a respectable life upon its foundation. When the foundation was threatened, he chose to murder rather than see the edifice collapse. Each choice flowed from the one before, a chain of moral compromises stretching across decades. Holmes tamped out his pipe and set it aside. That is the peculiar tyranny of time that Sir Alister understood so well. The past is not static, Watson. It does not simply exist and then fade away. Rather, it remains active, shaping the present in ways we often fail to perceive. A lie told 40 years ago demanded maintenance through continued silence. That silence required the suppression of conscience, and when conscience finally asserted itself in Sir Alister's decision to reveal the truth, the entire structure of decades stood threatened. Blackwood chose murder because the alternative was the demolition of his life's work. You sound almost sympathetic to him. I am sympathetic to the human predicament he represents, though not to his choices. We are all in some measure prisoners of our past actions. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge our errors and accept their consequences, or whether we compound them through increasingly desperate attempts at concealment. Sir Alister chose acknowledgement, however belatedly. Blackwood chose concealment, and in doing so transformed himself from a man who had once given false testimony into a murderer. I rose and moved to the window, gazing out upon Baker Street, where the evening traffic was beginning to thin. "It seems to me," I said slowly, "that this case has been as much about time as about murder. The original crime was committed in 1875, yet its effects rippled forward through the decades until they produced a death in 1895. 20 years is a long time to carry guilt. Not nearly long enough, apparently. Had Blackwood carried it for another year or 5, Sir Alister might have died naturally and taken his secret to the grave. But time imposed its own pressure. Sir Alister grew old, contemplated his mortality, and found the burden insupportable. He demanded resolution while he still lived to witness it. That demand triggered everything that followed. Holmes joined me at the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The ancient Greeks believed that the Furies pursued those guilty of unavenged crimes, granting them no rest until justice was achieved. We modern men do not believe in Furies, but we have our own version. Conscience, memory, the accumulated weight of unacknowledged wrong. Sir Alister was pursued by such forces and sought relief through confession. Blackwood was pursued by them as well, but sought relief through silencing the confessor. Neither could escape because the past, once created, cannot be unmade, only understood, I offered, and judged. That is our peculiar role, Watson. We reconstruct the past, illuminate its hidden corners, and force acknowledgement of what has been concealed. In this case, we have served 2 forms of justice. Justice for Sir Alister, murdered for his belated honesty, and justice for Whitmore, destroyed by lies that have finally been exposed. Neither man gains what he lost, but the historical record at least approaches truth. As darkness fell over London, I found myself reflecting on the strange completeness of the case. Holmes had solved not one mystery but 2, separated by 20 years, yet intimately connected. He had demonstrated that time does not erase guilt but merely defers its reckoning, and that truth, however long buried, retains its power to disrupt and demand recognition. The following week brought a letter from the Colonial Office, formally acknowledging receipt of Sir Alister's documents and announcing the formation of a small commission to review the historical record of the British Honduras inquiry. The letter was bureaucratic in tone, offering no apology, expressing no particular emotion, but confirming that the matter would be examined and appropriate conclusions drawn. Holmes read this communication with a slight smile. "Appropriate conclusions," he repeated. "A masterpiece of official evasion. They will acknowledge very quietly that an error was made. They will note that all parties to the original injustice are now dead or imprisoned. They will express satisfaction that historical accuracy has been achieved, and then they will file the matter away and return to their present concerns. Is that enough? It is what we have. Perfect justice is impossible in this world, Watson. We content ourselves with the achievable. Truth acknowledged, guilt exposed, and the dead granted what vindication we can provide. Whitmore's name is cleared. Sir Alister's conscience, had he lived, would have been eased. Dr. Blackwood will spend his remaining years contemplating the consequences of choices made long ago. The past has been given its due." He moved to the mantelpiece and stood gazing at the correspondence stacked there, the daily accumulation of requests for his services. Already new cases demand attention. A missing heir in Northumberland, a disputed will in Cheapside, a question of forged paintings that has exercised several dealers in Bond Street. The present continually reasserts itself, pushing the past back into shadow. But we shall remember this case, Watson, as an exemplar of a particular truth. What truth is that? Holmes turned to face me, and in the firelight his features took on that quality of austere wisdom that I had observed in moments of deepest reflection. That the past is never inert. It waits, accumulates pressure, and eventually demands recognition. We may attempt to bury it, ignore it, deny it, but it remains active beneath the surface, and when it finally erupts into the present as it did in Montague Square, the violence of its emergence is proportional to the length and force of its suppression. He paused, then added with quiet finality, "Sir Alister understood this. He attempted to give the past its voice before death silenced him. In that attempt he demonstrated more courage than he had shown in all his years of discretion. The tragedy is not that he failed, but that his failure was necessary to achieve the truth he sought. His death became the evidence that proved his point, that secrets kept too long become dangerous, and that justice delayed is justice demanding its due with interest compounded across decades." I took up my pen that evening and began to write the account that would eventually become this narrative. As I recorded the events in Montague Square, I found myself returning again and again to Holmes's central insight, that we live not merely in the present, but in the accumulated weight of all our past actions, and that truth, however inconvenient, however painful, possesses a kind of gravitational force that eventually draws all things toward acknowledgement. The last confidential file had been closed, not through continued concealment, but through exposure. Its contents, so carefully guarded for 20 years, had been released into the light, and in that release, both liberation and judgment had been achieved. Sir Alister could rest, his conscience finally eased, Whitmore could be remembered honestly, and Dr. Blackwood would face the consequences he had spent a lifetime attempting to evade. It was, I reflected as I set down my pen, an ending that was also a beginning. The beginning of truth after decades of falsehood. The beginning of justice after years of injustice postponed. The past had spoken, and we had given it voice. That, in the end, was all that we could do, and perhaps all that any honest chronicler could hope to achieve.